They say the ocean has no memory, that it simply swallows steel and bone alike, returning instantly to silence. But there are some nights when the Atlantic refuses to forget. In 1956, Italy launched a floating miracle. She was the Andrea Doria. She was not just a ship, she was a national promise. She was built with 11 watertight compartments, equipped with the latest radar, and designed to be the safest vessel ever to sail the seas. She was a masterpiece of art and engineering, carrying the rich and the hopeful toward the bright lights of New York. But in the heavy fog south of Nantucket, a different kind of destiny was waiting. While orchestras played in the lounge and passengers toasted to the future, a mathematical error was moving toward them at 40 knots. In the span of a single heartbeat, a palace of light was turned into a tilting tomb. This is not just a story about a collision. It is a story about the arrogance of the modern world. It is about the moment when our faith in technology was shattered by the crude reality of physics. It is the story of a girl who flew, a captain who stayed, and the terrible silence that follows the crash. So, turn down the lights, pour yourself a drink. Join me as we descend into the fog to uncover how the most beautiful ship in the world became the deep sea's most tragic ghost. The ocean does not hate us. It simply does not know we are here. It is a vast, indifferent machine of salt and pressure, moving to tides drawn by the moon, entirely unconcerned with the steel shells we construct to travel across its surface. To the sailor, the ocean is a workplace. To the passenger, it is a view, a backdrop for cocktails and romance. But to the historian of disasters, the ocean is a graveyard that patiently waits for human arrogance to make a mistake. On the night of July 25, 1956, the Atlantic Ocean was waiting. It had prepared the stage with a specific kind of weather, a meteorological curtain drawn tight across the throat of the shipping lanes south of Nantucket. Fog. Not the mist that clings to a morning meadow, but a dense, suffocating blanket. A physical weight, the kind of fog that swallows sound and distorts light, turning the world into a grey, featureless void. In this void, the horizon vanishes. The sky and the sea merge into a single, impenetrable wall. Inside this wall, two great cities of steel were moving toward each other. They were traveling at a combined speed of 40 knots, closing the distance between them by a mile every 90 seconds. On one side, the SS Andrea Doria, the pride of Italy, a floating palace of art and light, carrying the hopes of a nation recovering from the ashes of war. On the other side, the MS Stockholm, a Swedish liner, smaller, sharper, built for the icy waters of Scandinavia. A ship designed with a bow like a razor. They were invisible to one another. The officers on the bridges could see nothing but the swirling grey vapour pressing against the glass. And yet, they were not afraid. They were calm. They were confident. Because they had a new god, they had radar. In 1956, radar was the miracle. It was the eye that could see in the dark. It was the promise that technology had finally conquered the elements. The men in the wheelhouses believed that the glowing green line sweeping across their circular screens was the ultimate truth. They believed that the blips of light told them everything they needed to know. They were wrong. The radar showed them presence, but it did not show them intention. It showed them distance, but it did not show them the future. And so, under the cover of the fog, blinded by their faith in the machine, they drove their ships toward a mathematical point of intersection that would shatter the silence of the Atlantic and prove once again that the ocean always wins. This is not a story about bad luck. It is a story about the seduction of safety. It is a story about how we build unsinkable things and then steer them into the dark with our eyes closed. Let us go back to the beginning of the voyage. Let us step aboard the Andrea Doria before the fog rolled in. To understand the tragedy, you must understand the ship. The Andrea Doria was not just a vessel. She was a statement. World War II had left Italy broken, its industrial spine snapped, its reputation in tatters. The country needed a symbol of rebirth. It needed something to show the world that Italian craftsmanship, Italian art, and Italian elegance was still alive. The Andrea Doria was that answer. She was launched in 1951, and she was beautiful. While other nations were building ships that prioritized size or raw speed, the Italian line focused on beauty. She was an art gallery at sea. Her decks were lined with ceramics, murals, and tapestries. She had 3 outdoor swimming pools, a novelty at the time, tiered down the aft decks like a cascading waterfall. But beneath the luxury, there was a rigid obsession with safety. The designers knew the history of the Titanic. They knew the history of the Lusitania. They were determined to build a ship that could not die. The hull was divided into 11 watertight compartments. The engineers had calculated the buoyancy with obsessive precision. The theory was simple. If 2 of these compartments were flooded simultaneously, the ship would remain afloat. She would list, she would tilt, but she would not sink. This calculation was the shield. It was the number that allowed the captain to sleep at night. It was the statistic printed in the brochures. Safety, the marketing materials whispered. Certainty. But there was a flaw in the math. A flaw that was not in the steel, but in the assumption of how the steel would break. The engineers assumed that any damage would be symmetrical, or at least manageable. They did not account for a wound so deep and at such a specific angle that it would bypass their safeguards entirely. But on this final voyage heading west toward New York, no one was thinking about watertight doors. They were thinking about arrival. The ship was commanded by Captain Piero Calamai. He was a man of the old school, aristocratic, serious, deeply experienced. He had spent his life at sea, surviving the war, serving in the Navy, and rising to command the flagship of the Italian merchant marine. He loved the Andrea Doria. He treated her not as a machine, but as a living entity. Calamai was a cautious man. He was known for spending hours on the bridge, pacing, watching. He did not trust the sea. But even a cautious man is subject to the pressures of his time, and the pressure of the 1950s was the schedule. Time was the new currency. The airlines were beginning to eat into the ocean liner business. Planes could cross the Atlantic in hours. Ships took days. To compete, the liners had to be reliable. They had to be on time. Docking workers were paid by the hour. Passengers had trains to catch. The schedule was a contract that could not be broken. So, as the Andrea Doria approached the coast of the United States on that final afternoon, she was moving fast. She was slicing through the water at 21 knots. And then the weather turned. The Nantucket Shoals are a graveyard for a reason. It is the place where the warm Gulf Stream crashes into the cold Labrador Current. The collision of temperatures creates a weather system that is almost alive. The air cools instantly, the moisture condenses, and the fog is born. It happened in the late afternoon. The blue sky turned white, then grey. The horizon dissolved. The sun became a pale, diffusing disk, and then vanished altogether. Captain Calamai was on the bridge. He saw the wall of white approaching. He ordered the foghorn to be sounded. Whoo! The deep, mournful blast shook the glass of the bridge windows. Every 100 seconds the horn would sound, a warning to the void. But Calamai did not stop the ship. He did not significantly reduce her speed. He dropped her from 23 knots to 21, a token gesture, a nod to caution but not a surrender to it. To slow down significantly would mean arriving late in New York. It would mean tugboats waiting on overtime. It would mean a blemish on the perfect record of the Italian line. And besides, he had the radar. Let us pause to look at this machine. In the modern world, we are used to digital precision. We are used to screens that tell us exactly where we are, down to the inch. But the radar of 1956 was an analog beast. It was a cathode ray tube, a glowing green phosphor display housed in a heavy metal cabinet. A rotating antenna high on the mast swept the horizon, sending out pulses of radio waves. When those waves hit something, another ship, a coastline, they bounced back. The screen showed a blip, a smudge of light. It required interpretation. A blip did not have a label. It did not say, "This is a tanker," or "This is a fishing boat." It did not tell you which way the object was moving, or how fast. To know that, the officer had to watch the blip over time. He had to take a grease pencil and mark the position on the glass screen, then wait, then mark it again, then wait, then mark it a third time. Only by connecting the dots could he calculate the course of the stranger in the fog. It was a system that demanded patience. It demanded time, and it demanded that the officer on the bridge was not tired, not distracted, and not overconfident. On the bridge of the Andrea Doria, the officers watched the screen. They saw a blip. It was 17 miles away, a tiny speck of light in the electronic darkness. They tracked it. They did the math in their heads. They believed they knew what the other ship was doing. But miles away, on the bridge of the Stockholm, another set of eyes was watching the same radar, seeing the same blip, and coming to a completely different conclusion. The MS Stockholm was the opposite of the Andrea Doria in almost every way. She was the smallest liner on the North Atlantic run. She was white, sharp-nosed, and practical. She was not a palace. She was a ferry for the working class and the sensible traveler. She was heading east away from New York toward Gothenburg, Sweden. She was under the command of Captain Gunnar Nordenson, a disciplinarian, a man known for his rigid adherence to rules. But Nordenson was not on the bridge. He had gone to his cabin to work on paperwork, leaving the ship in the hands of his third officer, Johan Ernst Carstens Johansson. Carstens was young. He was 26 years old. He was bright, eager, and confident. He stood alone on the bridge of the Stockholm, the master of the vessel for his watch. The fog had not yet wrapped around the Stockholm. The moon was still visible on his side of the ocean, but ahead he saw the dark wall where the Doria was hiding. He looked at his radar. He saw the blip of the Italian ship. It was to his left, or so he thought. This is the hinge upon which the disaster turns, the interpretation of a smudge of light. To the officers on the Andrea Doria, the Stockholm appeared to be on a parallel course that would allow them to pass starboard to starboard, right side to right side. To the officer on the Stockholm, the Andrea Doria appeared to be on a course that would allow them to pass port to port, left side to left side. These two realities could not both be true. One of them was a hallucination born of limited data and human assumption. But because neither ship spoke to the other, because the radios remained silent, both crews retreated into their own private certainties. They were like two men walking down a narrow hallway, both stepping to the same side to let the other pass, unknowingly stepping directly into each other's path. But they were not walking. They were moving at 20 knots. Let us leave the cold tension of the bridge for a moment. Let us descend. Down the staircases, past the murals and the statues, into the belly of the floating city. It is the last night of the voyage. The atmosphere on board the Andrea Doria is one of celebration. In the first-class dining room, the orchestra is playing. Men in tuxedos are lighting cigars. Women in silk gowns are laughing, their jewelry catching the light of the chandeliers. They are eating a farewell dinner. Cannelloni, veal scallopine, champagne. There is a sense of melancholy, the sweet sadness of a journey ending. Tomorrow they will see the Statue of Liberty. Tomorrow the bubble of luxury will pop and they will return to the real world of taxes and traffic and jobs. But for tonight, they are suspended in a golden dream. Below them in cabin class, the party is rowdier. Paper streamers hang from the ceiling. People are dancing. There is less jewelry, but more noise. And below that, in tourist class, deep in the hull, the families are packing. These are the immigrants, the people moving to America for a new life. They are sleeping 4, sometimes 6 to a cabin. They are close to the waterline. They can hear the rush of the ocean against the steel plates. They can feel the vibration of the engines, a constant rhythmic thrumming that shakes the frames of the bunk beds. Among these thousands of souls, let us find one. Her name is Linda Morgan. She is 14 years old. She is traveling with her mother, her stepfather, and her younger sister. She is an American girl born in Mexico, raised in Spain, now heading to New York. She is caught between worlds, a child of the international set, fluent in languages, used to travel. But tonight, she is just a tired teenager. Her family has been assigned 2 cabins on the upper deck, cabin 52 and cabin 54. It is a detail that seems trivial, a number stamped on a brass key, a location on a blueprint. But in the lottery of survival, geography is everything. Linda's stepfather, Camille Chianfara, is a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, a man of intellect and words. He and Linda's mother occupy one cabin. Linda and her 8-year-old sister are in the other, but there is a change of plans, a small domestic negotiation. The younger sister is fussy. She wants to be near her mother. And so a switch is made. Linda will sleep alone in cabin 52. Her sister will sleep with the parents in cabin 54. Linda Morgan walks into cabin 52. It is on the starboard side, the right side, of the ship. It faces the ocean. She changes into her pajamas. She climbs into the bed. The sheets are crisp and cool. She is tired. The motion of the ship is a gentle cradle. She does not know about the fog. She does not know about the radar. She does not know that she is sleeping directly against the steel skin of the ship, the only barrier between her and the Atlantic. She closes her eyes. She drifts into dreams. She is the innocent passenger, the one who has made no choices, taken no risks, assumed no authority. She is simply there, a soft, breathing variable in a hard steel equation. While she sleeps, the machinery of the night grinds on. On the bridge of the Andrea Doria, Captain Calamai is uneasy. The fog is thick, terrible. He steps out onto the wing of the bridge, the wind whipping his coat. He stares into the nothingness. He cannot see the bow of his own ship. He returns to the radar. The blip is closer, 4 miles. He turns to his second officer. "She is coming fast," he says. He orders a slight course correction, a turn to port, to the left. He wants to widen the gap. He wants to give the stranger more room. It is a decision made with the best of intentions. He believes he is steering away from danger. But on the Stockholm, the young officer Carstens sees the Andrea Doria turn. But because of the delay in the radar sweep, and because of the angle, he misinterprets the movement. He thinks the Doria is staying on course, or perhaps drifting slightly. He decides to make his own move. He orders a turn to starboard, to the right. Think of the hallway again, 2 people facing each other. One steps left, the other steps right. They have mirrored each other. Instead of moving apart, they have aligned their trajectories perfectly. The distance is now 2 miles. The fog is a shroud. The sound of the Doria's horn, whoo, is swallowed by the mist. The Stockholm does not sound her horn. In the clear air where she sits, the rules say she does not have to. She is silent, a ghost ship running with lights blazing, but muffled by the atmospheric wall. The passengers are beginning to retire. The band in the first-class lounge is packing up their instruments. The dining stewards are clearing the tables, stacking the silver, folding the white linens. Down in the engine room of the Andrea Doria, the heat is intense. The air smells of oil and steam. The men wiping the gauges do not look at the radar. They listen to the telegraph. They wait for orders. Full ahead, half ahead, stop. They feel the ship banking slightly as Calamai makes his turn. They adjust their footing on the metal gratings. They do not know that this turn is the death warrant of the ship. 1 mile. On the radar screens, the 2 blips are now glowing fiercely. They are no longer distant specks. They are blobs of light, merging, separating, pulsing. The officers are tense. They lean forward. The glow of the tubes illuminates their sweating faces. "Why doesn't he turn?" one of them whispers. "He will," the other answers. "He has to." Confidence. That is the killer. The absolute certainty that the other person sees what you see. The belief that the other person follows the same logic you follow. But the ocean is not logical. And the fog respects no rules. Linda Morgan shifts in her sleep. Her head rests on the pillow. Her breathing is slow, rhythmic. The distance is 1/2 mile. Suddenly the fog begins to shred. It is not a gradual lifting but a tearing. Wisps of grey vapor rip apart, and for the first time the visual world returns. On the bridge of the Stockholm, the lookout screams. Light on the port bow. Carstens looks up from the radar. He looks out the window. And there it is, not a blip, not a theory, a mountain. The Andrea Doria bursts out of the fog. She is terrifyingly close. She is a wall of black steel and blazing lights, towering over the smaller Swedish ship. She is so close that the officers on the Stockholm can see the glow of the portholes. They can see the name painted on the bow. Panic, pure cold adrenaline. "Hard a starboard," Carstens shouts. "Full astern." The helmsman spins the wheel. The engines scream as they try to reverse the momentum of thousands of tons of steel. The Stockholm shudders. Her nose begins to swing to the right, trying to claw away from the giant in front of her. On the Andrea Doria, Captain Calamai sees the lights of the Stockholm emerge from the mist. He sees the sharp, ice-breaking bow aiming directly at him. "Hard a port!" he yells. "Hard a port!" He is trying to swing the Doria's stern away. He is trying to outrun the impact. He is trying to make the ship dance, but a ship is not a dancer. It is a building. It carries the momentum of a freight train. The rudder bites into the water. The ship leans, the propellers churn. But physics is a cruel judge. There is no time. The math has already been solved. The two ships are no longer navigating. They are sliding uncontrollably toward a violent embrace. Linda Morgan is still asleep. The officers on the bridge of the Stockholm watch as their ship's prow, reinforced with extra steel for crushing Arctic ice, rises and falls on the swell. It is aimed like a spear. It is aimed at the starboard side of the Andrea Doria. It is aimed at the upper deck. It is aimed at cabin 52. The seconds stretch out. Time becomes elastic. The men on the bridges stop breathing. The passengers in the lounges pause, glasses halfway to their lips, sensing a sudden, violent shift in the ship's movement. The engines roar in reverse, a sound like a dying animal. The water foams and boils between the hulls. And then the waiting ends. The silence of the fog is broken not by a whisper, but by the loudest sound any of them will ever hear. The sound of two cities colliding. But we must stop here, right at the precipice, because the crash is not the story. The crash is just the beginning. The story is what happens when the lights go out, when the water rushes in, and when the grand ambition of the unsinkable dissolves into the chaotic reality of survival. The blips have merged. The steel is touching. Linda Morgan is dreaming, and the ocean is about to come inside. The collision of two massive ships at sea is not like a car crash. It is not a sudden, sharp bang that is over in an instant. It is a slow, grinding, screaming event. It is the sound of physics being dismantled. When the Stockholm struck the Andrea Doria, it was 11:10 at night. The Swedish ship, with her reinforced ice-breaking bow, did not just hit the Italian liner, she entered it. She drove into the starboard side of the Doria like a chisel driving into soft wood. She penetrated 30 feet deep. She sliced through steel plates, through bulkheads, through decks, through the generator room, and through the fuel tanks. For a moment, the two ships were locked together. A terrible, intimate embrace. The Stockholm was pinned inside the Doria, held fast by the twisted metal she had just destroyed. Then, the momentum of the Andrea Doria, still traveling at 20 knots, dragged her forward. She wrenched herself free, but as she pulled away, the Stockholm's bow acted like a hook. It ripped open the side of the Italian ship, tearing a gash 40 feet wide. It was a wound that no pump could fight. It was a wound that exposed the very heart of the ship to the Atlantic Ocean. The sound was apocalyptic. To the passengers in the dining salons, it sounded like a heavy thud, followed by the crash of 1,000 plates shattering. To the people in the cabins near the impact, it was the roar of the world ending. Steel screamed as it was torn apart. Rivets popped like gunfire. And then silence. For a heartbeat, the ship seemed to hang in the darkness, stunned. The vibration of the engines, which had been the constant heartbeat of the voyage for 8 days, faltered. The lights flickered. They dimmed to a dull orange, then died, plunging the corridors into absolute blackness. A second later, the emergency generators kicked in. The lights returned, but they were different now, weaker, casting long, shivering shadows. And with the light came the smell. The sharp, acrid scent of cordite, the heavy, choking smell of bunker oil, the smell of dust, centuries of dust, shaken loose from the spaces between the walls. But the most terrifying thing was not the smell, or the darkness, or the sound. It was the floor. Almost immediately, the Andrea Doria began to lean. Ships are designed to be upright. Every staircase, every doorway, every table is built on the assumption of a level horizon. When that horizon shifts, the architecture turns hostile. The Doria listed to starboard, first 5 degrees, then 10, then 18. 18 degrees is not a subtle tilt. At 18 degrees, you cannot walk without holding onto the handrails. At 18 degrees, loose furniture begins to slide. At 18 degrees, the swimming pools on the aft decks spill their water in a sudden cascading rush, washing over the teak planks like a miniature tsunami. Why did she list so quickly? This is where the tragedy moves from the bridge to the blueprints. The Andrea Doria was a top-heavy ship. She was built for luxury, for height, for grandeur. To keep her stable, her deep fuel tanks needed to be full, acting as ballast to weigh her down. But she was at the end of her voyage. Her tanks were almost empty. She was light. She was floating high in the water. When the Stockholm tore her open, the ocean rushed into the empty fuel tanks on the starboard side. Thousands of tons of water. Weight added to one side while the other side remained light and empty. The engineers had a system for this. It was called cross-flooding. The idea was to intentionally flood the tanks on the other side, the port side, to balance the weight and bring the ship upright. It was a good theory. It worked on paper. But the collision had destroyed the generator room. The pumps that were supposed to move the water were dead. The controls were smashed. The system that was designed to save the ship had been murdered in the first 3 seconds of the impact, so the ship leaned, and she kept leaning. Deep in the bowels of the vessel, the invisible workforce, the greasers, the firemen, the engineers, were fighting a battle that was already lost. The water did not trickle in, it thundered. It came in like a freight train. The sea was cold, 50 degrees, and it was black with oil. It swirled around the waists of the men in the engine room. They shouted orders over the roar of escaping steam. They tried to close valves, tried to reroute power, tried to isolate the damage, but the damage was everywhere. Imagine being in a steel room deep underwater with the lights flickering, the floor tilting under your feet at a crazy angle, and the ocean rising around your chest. These men did not run. They stayed. They stayed to keep the lights on. They knew that if the electricity died completely, panic would kill more people than the water. They were the first heroes of the night, and many of them were the first to die. Up on the bridge, Captain Calamai grabbed the railing to keep from sliding across the deck. He looked at the inclinometer, the instrument that measured the list. The needle was moving past 20 degrees, he knew. In that instant, looking at the needle, he knew his ship was dead. A list of 20 degrees within minutes of impact meant that the watertight compartments had been breached in a way that defied the math. The unsinkable design was failing because the design had assumed a polite accident. It had not assumed a massacre. He looked out into the fog. The fog was lifting now, as if satisfied with its work. He could see the other ship. The Stockholm was floating a few hundred yards away. She looked like a ruined prizefighter. Her bow was crushed, crumpled back like an accordion for 40 feet. But she was upright. She was bobbing in the water, wounded but stable. The irony was bitter. The small, sharp ship that had dealt the killing blow would survive. The great, beautiful palace was dying. Calamai turned to his officers. His voice was quiet. "Check the passengers," he said. "Get the boats ready." But even this order, the most basic command of the sea, was about to run into the cold reality of physics. Let us move to the boat deck. This is where the illusion of safety is stored. The lifeboats. White, pristine, covered in canvas, resting in their davits. There were enough lifeboats on the Andrea Doria to carry every single soul on board, plus the crew. It was a redundancy of survival. But the lifeboats were designed to be launched from a ship that was upright, or listing only slightly. The crew rushed to the port side, the high side of the ship. They began to crank the winches. They swung the davits out. But the ship was leaning 20 degrees to starboard. When they tried to lower the port side boats, the boats did not swing out over the water. They swung in. They scraped against the side of the ship. They banged against the glass of the promenade deck. The crew pushed, they shoved, they cursed, but gravity was against them. The angle was too steep. The boats were pinned against the hull by the weight of the world. Half the lifeboats, the entire portside fleet, were useless. They were right there, fully equipped, perfectly functional, yet utterly unreachable. Panic began to ripple through the crew. They ran to the starboard side, the low side. Here, the problem was the opposite. The ship was leaning so far over that the lifeboats swung out too far. They dangled 20 feet away from the side of the ship. To get into them, passengers would have to jump across a terrifying gap of black air, or climb down ropes into a swaying wooden shell. But at least they could be lowered. The math of survival had just changed. The Andrea Doria carried 1,706 people. The accessible lifeboats could carry only half that number. In the span of 10 minutes, the Andrea Doria had gone from a floating city to a sinking trap. Now, let us go inside the ship, to the corridors where the passengers are waking up. Sleep is a vulnerability. When you are asleep, you are stripped of your context. You are just a body. When the impact happened, hundreds of people were thrown from their beds. They woke up on the floor, in the dark, with the ship shaking. Confusion was the first emotion, not fear, but a deep, befuddled confusion. What happened? Is it a storm? Did a boiler explode? They fumbled for clothes. They opened their cabin doors and stepped into the hallways. The corridors of the Andrea Doria were long, carpeted tunnels. Now they were funnels. The list made the floor slant sideways. Walking was impossible. You had to walk with 1 foot on the floor and 1 foot on the wall. People began to emerge, ghosts in pajamas. Women clutching jewelry boxes, men holding shoes, parents carrying children. There was no screaming yet. There was a strange, muffled silence. The shock was a sedative. People spoke in whispers. "What is it? I don't know." "The lights are low. We are tilting." They began to move upward. It is a primal instinct. If the water is coming from below, you go up. They climbed the stairs, hauling themselves up by the banisters. The elderly struggled. The slant made the stairs treacherous. If you slipped, you didn't just fall down, you fell sideways, sliding across the width of the landing, crashing into the wall. Smoke began to drift through the hallways. It wasn't fire smoke, it was the dust of the impact and the steam from ruptured pipes. It gave the scene a dreamlike, hazy quality. In the first-class lounge, the furniture had slid into a heap on the starboard wall. Grand pianos, velvet armchairs, heavy tables, all piled up in a tangled mess. Passengers stood on the high side of the room, holding onto pillars, looking down at the wreckage of their luxury. The stewards, trained to be invisible and helpful, were now just as lost as the passengers. They wore their white jackets, but their eyes were wide. They tried to reassure people. "It is nothing, signore, a minor technical difficulty." But the angle of the floor called them liars, and then the sound of the siren. 7 short blasts, followed by 1 long blast. The signal for abandon ship. It is a sound that bypasses the intellect and goes straight to the nervous system. It is the sound of the contract being broken. The ship is no longer a shelter. It is a danger. You must leave, but leave to where? The passengers spilled out onto the promenade deck. The fog had lifted completely now. The moon was out. The sky was a canopy of indifferent stars. And there in the moonlight they saw the ocean. It was closer than it should have been. On the starboard side, the water was only a few yards below the railing. The black Atlantic was rising to meet them. On the port side, the deck loomed high in the air, a cliff edge hanging over the dark. And they saw the lifeboats. They saw the crew struggling with the davits. They saw the port boats stuck, useless. They saw the starboard boats swinging wildly over the water. This is the moment where the social fabric begins to tear. In a disaster, civilization is a thin veneer. It holds for a while. People are polite. They wait their turn. They help the weak. But as the angle increases, as the realization of the lifeboat shortage sets in, the veneer begins to crack. But on the Andrea Doria, something strange happened. There was no stampede. There was no riot. The sheer scale of the disorientation seemed to freeze people. They stood in clusters, holding onto the railings, waiting. They were waiting for someone to tell them what to do. They were waiting for the authority of the uniform, but the authority was paralyzed. The public address system was broken. The captain could not speak to his passengers. He could not tell them which way to go. He could not tell them that help was coming. Information became a commodity. Rumors flew down the decks. The boiler exploded. "We hit an iceberg. The captain is dead. We are sinking." And deep inside the ship, below the decks where the passengers were gathering, the tragedy was already absolute. The impact point, the wound. We must look at it. We cannot look away. The bow of the Stockholm had struck the cabins on the upper deck, cabins 46, 48, 52, 54. These were the cabins of the immigrant families. No, these were the first-class cabins, the expensive seats. The collision had not discriminated by class, but by geometry. In those cabins there was no waking up. There was no confusion. There was simply the intrusion of the Stockholm's steel bow. Walls vanished, floors dissolved, beds were crushed. The violence was instantaneous and total. In cabin 54, Camille Cianfara, the foreign correspondent, had been reading in bed. His wife was brushing her hair. Their 8-year-old daughter was sleeping in the other bed. When the steel came, it took the father. He died instantly, crushed by the debris of his own room. The mother was pinned, trapped between the wreckage of the bed and the twisted wall. The 8-year-old girl was thrown into the chaos. And in cabin 52, the cabin where Linda Morgan was sleeping, the cabin was gone. It simply wasn't there anymore. The space where Linda Morgan had been dreaming was now occupied by the crushed steel of the Stockholm's bow. The wall was gone. The floor was gone. The bed was gone. To the people in the hallway, looking into the gaping hole where cabin 52 used to be, it appeared that everyone inside must have been obliterated, vaporized by the impact. There was nothing left but jagged metal and the sound of the ocean rushing in below. The tragedy of the Andrea Doria is often remembered as a successful sinking because so many people were saved, and that is true. It was the greatest sea rescue in history. But in these first 20 minutes before the rescue began, there was no success. There was only the brutal calculus of damage. 51 people died on the Andrea Doria. Most of them died in the split second of impact. They did not drown, they were crushed. They were casualties of a traffic accident at sea. But for the 1,600 survivors huddled on the listing deck, the danger was just beginning. They looked at the water. They looked at the tilting deck. They looked at the few lifeboats that were successfully lowered into the black swells. And they did the math. There were too many people. There were too few boats. The unsinkable ship was groaning. The steel was twisting. Inside the hull, partitions were failing under the pressure of the water. Air pockets were exploding. The passengers realized that they were alone. The radar had failed them. The design had failed them. The schedule had failed them. They were no longer clients of the Italian line. They were refugees on a dying island. And as the ship rolled a degree further, a collective realization swept over the crowd. It was a cold, heavy silence. The silence of people who realize that their survival is no longer a guarantee, but a question. A question that the ocean was waiting to answer. The Stockholm pulled back slightly, disengaging from the wound. The water rushed into the gap with a sucking roar. The Andrea Doria shuddered. She was heavy now, lethargic. She had lost the grace of a liner and taken on the heaviness of a corpse. And somewhere in the wreckage, in the twisted metal that connected the living to the dead, a miracle was waiting to be found. But for now, there was only the list, the terrible, unceasing list. The angle of the deck was 22 degrees, and the night was young. Gravity is a law. But on a sinking ship, gravity becomes a tyrant. It changes the rules of movement. It turns a floor into a wall. It turns a staircase into a trap. Deep in the hull of the Andrea Doria, far below the moonlight and the fresh air of the promenade, the third-class passengers were learning the cruelty of this new geometry. They were the immigrants. The families from Calabria and Sicily, carrying their lives in cardboard suitcases. They were sleeping nearest to the waterline, nearest to the point of impact. When the collision happened, their world did not just tilt, it disintegrated. The lights in the lower corridors died instantly. The emergency circuits struggled, flickering on and off, casting strobe-light glimpses of a nightmare. Water was rising through the floorboards, but it was not clean Atlantic water. It was a slurry of oil, sewage, and debris. It was slick and black, coating everything it touched. To survive, these passengers had to climb, but the list of the ship was now 25 degrees. In the narrow steel corridors of the lower decks, this meant walking on the corner where the wall met the floor. Imagine a labyrinth of steel, pitch black, filling with oily water, tilted so steeply that you have to crawl on your hands and knees. Now add the screaming. Mothers tied their children to their waists with belts or ropes, fearing that if they let go, the little ones would slide down into the rising black water. Old men whose lungs were already dusted with the labor of years gasped in the thick, humid air. They formed human chains, stranger gripping stranger, pulling each other up the stairwells. There was no announcements here, no officers in white uniforms to guide them. There was only the roar of the water below and the instinct to reach the sky. Some of them found their way blocked. The collision had warped the frames of the watertight doors. They were jammed shut. People pounded on the steel with their fists, screaming to be let through. But the steel did not care. For some, the journey ended there in the dark, trapped behind a jammed door, waiting for the water to reach the ceiling. But for others, the journey was just beginning. They burst out onto the upper decks covered in black oil, their eyes wide with the shock of the ascent. They emerged into the cool night air like miners escaping a collapse, only to find that the ground they stood on was slowly sliding into the sea. And while these hundreds struggled to escape the ship, one person had already left it. But she had not used a lifeboat. She had not jumped. She had not swum. Let us return to the mystery of cabin 52, the cabin that had vanished. The cabin where 14-year-old Linda Morgan had been sleeping. When the Stockholm's bow smashed into the Andrea Doria, the physics of the collision created a moment of freakish, impossible violence. The Stockholm's nose was a crumpled mass of steel, a jagged wreckage of crushed metal. On the deck of the Stockholm, minutes after the crash, a Spanish sailor named Bernabe Polanco was checking the damage. The Stockholm was stationary, bobbing in the water, her bow destroyed. Polanco heard a sound. It was faint, a whimper. He climbed over the twisted railing, moving carefully across the wreckage of his own ship's bow. He shone his flashlight into the shadows of the crumpled steel. He saw something yellow. It was pajamas. He moved closer. He found a girl. She was huddled in a small pocket of debris, terrified, confused, but alive. It was Linda Morgan. The physics of the crash had performed a dark miracle. When the sharp prow of the Stockholm sliced into the Andrea Doria, it had gone directly under Linda's bed. It had acted like a giant shovel. It had scooped her up, bed and all, and when the Stockholm pulled back, it carried her with it. She had been catapulted from one ship to the other. She woke up not in her cabin, but on the bow of the ship that had just destroyed her family. She looked at the sailor. She did not know where she was. She did not know how she had gotten there. She spoke in Spanish, a language she knew from her childhood. "Where is my mother?" she asked. The sailor did not know. He carefully lifted her out of the wreckage. She was bruised, her knees were hurt, but she was whole. He carried her to the infirmary of the Stockholm. Meanwhile, on the Andrea Doria, her stepfather was dead. Her mother was pinned in the wreckage of cabin 54, screaming for help that would take hours to arrive. Her sister was lost in the chaos. Linda Morgan was the miracle girl. The press would later call her that. They would turn her survival into a fairy tale. But on that night, there was no magic. There was only the brutal randomness of mechanics. 2 feet to the left, 2 feet to the right, and she would have been crushed. She survived because the steel folded in a specific shape. She survived because of an angle. Back on the Andrea Doria, the angle was getting worse. It was now past midnight. The list was nearly 30 degrees. The ship was dying. Everyone knew it. The passengers standing on the high side of the deck could look down the sloping hull and see the water creeping up toward the promenade. But a strange thing was happening. The panic, which had threatened to break the surface earlier, had settled into a weird, gelatinous calm. Psychologists call it disaster shock. It is a state where the brain, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the threat, simply shuts down the emotional centers. People become docile, they become quiet. On the promenade deck, men were smoking cigarettes, flicking the ash into the ocean that was rising to meet them. Women sat on their suitcases staring at the moon. A kind of courtesy returned. "After you." "No, please, take the rope." It was the calm of the condemned. They believed they were going to die. They believed that the few lifeboats in the water were not enough. They saw the lights of the Stockholm in the distance, but the Stockholm was not moving. It was crippled. It could not come to them. They were alone in the Atlantic. And then the horizon changed. To the west, a light appeared, a bright, burning star on the water. Then another, then another. The radio operators on the Andrea Doria had sent out the SOS immediately after the impact. SOS, SOS, collision. Need immediate assistance. The Atlantic is a busy highway, and the code of the sea is absolute. When a ship calls for help, you answer. The first to arrive was a small fruit freighter, the Cape Ann, then a military transport, the Thomas H. Barry. But the savior, the giant that would turn the night from a tragedy into a rescue, was the Ile-de-France. The Ile-de-France was a legend, a massive French ocean liner, nearly as big as the Andrea Doria. She was eastbound, heading to Europe. Her captain, Baron Raoul de Baudéant, had heard the distress call. He did not hesitate. He turned his massive ship around. He pushed her boilers to the breaking point. He drove her through the fading fog like a charging bull. When the Ile-de-France arrived, she did not just sit off in the distance. Captain de Baudéant performed a piece of seamanship that bordered on the reckless. He brought his massive ship right up to the Andrea Doria. He parked his liner only 400 yards away from the sinking Italian vessel. And then he turned on the lights. Every light on the Ile-de-France was illuminated. The name of the ship, glowing in huge red neon letters between her funnels, burned in the night. Floodlights swept across the water, turning the black ocean into a brilliant, dazzling stage. To the passengers on the listing deck of the Andrea Doria, it was a religious experience. One moment, they were standing in the dark, waiting to drown. The next, a city of light had appeared next to them. A cheer went up, a ragged, tearful cheer. The French are here. The French are here. The Ile-de-France lowered her lifeboats. All of them. Other ships lowered theirs. Suddenly, the water between the two liners was swarming with small boats. The rescue had begun. But a rescue at sea is not a simple transfer. It is a terrifying physical ordeal. The Andrea Doria was listing so badly that the ladders on the side of the ship hung out over the empty air. To get off the ship, passengers had to slide down ropes or climb down swaying cargo nets that were slick with oil. Imagine an 80-year-old grandmother wearing a nightgown and a life jacket. She is standing at the rail. The water is dark and churning below. A young sailor yells at her to grab the rope. She has to climb over the railing. She has to trust her grip. She has to swing out into the void, dangling like a spider, while the ship groans and shudders behind her. It was a scene of medieval torture mixed with modern logistics. Parents had to make the most impossible choice of their lives. The lifeboats bobbing below rose and fell with the swell. Sometimes they were 10 feet down, sometimes they were 20. Fathers held their babies over the railing. The sailors in the boats below stood up, arms outstretched. "Drop him!" the sailors would scream. "Drop him now!" And the fathers had to let go. They had to watch their children fall through the air, praying that the sailor would catch them, praying that the boat wouldn't lurch away at the last second, praying that the bundle wouldn't hit the gunwale and bounce into the sea. One by one, they dropped. One by one, they were caught. There were accidents. Ankles were broken. Ribs were cracked. But the human chain held. The oil was the enemy of dignity. It sprayed up from the water, coating everyone in a thick, sticky tar. It ruined the silk gowns of the first-class women. It matted the hair of the children. It made the ropes slippery. It turned the survivors into dark, uniform statues. By 3 a.m., the evacuation was in full rhythm. It was a conveyor belt of fear. Climb down, jump, huddle in the boat, motor across the gap, climb up the side of the rescue ship. On the bridge of the Andrea Doria, Captain Calamai remained. He was a broken man. He watched his passengers leave. He watched the lights of the Ile-de-France illuminating the death of his ship. He knew that his career was over. He knew that he would be blamed, but he still had work to do. He directed the evacuation with a quiet, tragic efficiency. He ensured that the injured were lowered in baskets. He ensured that the crew stayed until the passengers were off. There was a moment of tension in the lifeboats. The law of the sea says, women and children first. But in the chaos, some men panicked. Some crew members panicked. There were boats that pulled away half empty, filled with waiters and stokers, leaving passengers behind. But these were the exceptions. For the most part, the social contract held. The strong waited for the weak. As the dawn approached, the Andrea Doria was nearly empty. The list had reached 40 degrees. The starboard rail was now underwater. The swimming pools were part of the ocean. Captain Calamai stood in the chart room. He looked at the maps, he looked at the logbook. He made a decision. He would not leave. It is an ancient tradition romanticized in books, but terrifying in reality. The captain goes down with the ship. Calamai felt that he had failed his duty. He felt that the ship was his body, and if the body died, the head should die with it. He told his remaining officers to go. "Get to the boats," yes, he said. "I'm staying." But his officers refused. They were loyal. They surrounded him. They argued with him. They told him that his death would serve no purpose. They told him that he had to testify to tell the truth of what happened. They practically physically forced him to leave. Reluctantly, heavily, Calamai walked down the slanting deck. He was one of the last men to step off the Andrea Doria. As he sat in the lifeboat, pulling away, he did not look back. He buried his face in his hands. The sun rose. July 26, 1956. The fog was gone. The sky was a brilliant, cruel blue. The ocean sparkled in the sunlight. And there, in the center of this beautiful morning, lay the corpse of the Andrea Doria. She was abandoned now, a ghost ship. She lay on her side like a sleeping whale. The red paint of her hull was exposed to the air. The propellers, massive bronze blades that had driven her across the ocean, were now hanging motionless above the water. The rescue ships, the Ile-de-France, the Stockholm, the others, began to steam away, heading for New York with their cargo of survivors. But a few planes circled overhead, news helicopters, photographers. They were there to capture the final moment. The death of a ship is a slow, agonizing process. It is not sudden. It is a loss of will. For hours she floated on her side. The water crept into the portholes. It filled the dining rooms, the ballrooms, the cabins. It saturated the carpets and the tapestries. It extinguished the last air pockets. At 10 o'clock in the morning, 10 hours after the collision, the end came. The Andrea Doria rolled. She turned her belly to the sky. The sea rushed into her funnels. The great stack, painted with the Italian colors, dipped below the surface. The water boiled and foamed. Then the bow dipped. She began to slide. Quietly, smoothly. She did not break apart like the Titanic. She stayed whole. She slipped beneath the surface with a terrifying grace. The stern rose high into the air, pausing for a second, as if waving goodbye. And then she was gone. The ocean closed over her. There was a massive upwelling of bubbles, a cauldron of white foam. Debris shot to the surface, deck chairs, life jackets, crates of wine. And then the water calmed. The ripples faded. The Atlantic returned to its flat, indifferent state. It was as if she had never been there. 11 hours earlier, she had been a palace of light and music. Now she was a wreck, falling through the cold darkness, heading for the bottom 250 feet down. The survivors, watching from the decks of the rescue ships, wept. They wept for their lost possessions, for their terror, for the friends they had made who were now gone. But mostly, they wept for the shock of it, the realization of how fragile their world was. Linda Morgan, the girl who had flown, was lying in a hospital bed in New York waiting for news of her family. She did not yet know that her father was dead. She did not yet know that her sister had died in the wreckage. She was the miracle. But miracles have a cost. The crisis was over. The adrenaline was fading. The noise of the sirens and the shouting had been replaced by the steady thrum of the rescue ship's engines. But for the survivors, the silence was louder than the crash. They sat in blankets, drinking coffee, staring at the sea. They were safe. They were alive. But they were different people now. The ocean had taken their certainty. It had taken their faith in the machine. It had shown them that no matter how much steel you wrap yourself in, no matter how much radar you buy, you are always just one mistake away from the dark. The Andrea Doria was gone. But the story was not over. The story was about to move from the sea to the courtroom, and from the courtroom to the memory. The ship was dead. The legend was just being born. New York City is a machine that runs on stories. It devours them. And when the rescue ships arrived at the piers of Manhattan on July 26th, the city was starving. The piers were a mob scene. Thousands of people pressed against the police barricades. Reporters, photographers, newsreel cameramen. They climbed onto cranes and piles of cargo to get a better angle. They were looking for the tragic faces of the widows. They were looking for the heroic captains. But mostly they were looking for the girl The story of Linda Morgan had traveled faster than the rescue ships, the miracle girl, the teenager who had flown through the air on a mattress and survived the collision of the century. It was the perfect headline. It was the sugar that helped the public swallow the bitter pill of the tragedy. When Linda was brought off the ship, she was not treated as a victim. She was treated as a celebrity. Flashbulbs popped in her face like lightning. Microphones were shoved toward her hospital bed. "How do you feel, Linda? What was it like? Do you feel lucky?" Lucky. That was the word they used. Consider the cruelty of that word. Linda Morgan had lost her stepfather. She had lost her younger sister. Her mother was in critical condition, battered and broken in another hospital. Her family had been decimated. But the narrative required a miracle. The world needed to believe that in the midst of mechanical failure and death, there was a spark of divine intervention. Linda became that spark. She was the proof that God was watching. She shrank from the light. She was 14 years old. She was in pain. She did not feel like a miracle. She felt like a survivor of a war zone. This is the first legacy of the Andrea Doria, the simplification of trauma. The media took a complex, horrific event, a failure of radar, a failure of command, a failure of engineering, and turned it into a human interest story about a flying girl. It is easier to talk about miracles than it is to talk about mistakes, but for the other survivors, there were no headlines. There was only the quiet, grinding aftermath. They went home to New Jersey, to California, to Italy. They tried to return to their jobs. They tried to sleep in their own beds. But the ocean followed them. Many of them developed what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1956, it didn't have a name. It was just called nerves. They couldn't sleep without a light on. They couldn't take a bath because the sound of the water rising in the tub reminded them of the list. They couldn't ride in elevators because the sensation of the floor moving beneath them triggered a panic attack. And they had the guilt. Survivor's guilt is a specific kind of poison. It is a mathematical obsession. Why did I live? Why did the person in the next cabin die? The passengers of the Andrea Doria knew how close it had been. They knew that if the ship had stayed afloat for 1 hour less, the loss of life would have been in the thousands. They knew that if the impact had been 10 feet further forward or 10 feet further aft, the outcome would have been different. They replayed the night in their heads. The scramble for the lifeboats, the fathers dropping their children, the silence of the fog. They realized that their survival was not a reward for their virtue. It was not a testament to their strength. It was simply a matter of where they were standing when the steel tore open. They had been saved by geometry. And that is a cold thing to make peace with. While the survivors wrestled with their ghosts, the maritime world wrestled with the blame. Who was at fault? The Italian captain Calamai, who was speeding in the fog, or the Swedish officer Carstens, who turned his ship into the path of the oncoming liner? The legal battle that followed was one of the most expensive in history. The lawyers for the Italian line blamed the Swedish line. The lawyers for the Swedish line blamed the Italian line. They produced charts, radar plots, hydrodynamic studies. They prepared for a trial that would expose every secret, every error, every moment of negligence. But the trial never happened. 3 months into the hearings, the insurance companies intervened. They did the math. A public trial would damage the reputation of the entire ocean liner industry. It would make passengers afraid to sail. It would reveal that radar was not a magic shield, but a difficult, fallible tool. So they settled. The Italian line and the Swedish line agreed to stop blaming each other. They established a victims' fund. They paid the claims. They sealed the records. The truth was buried under a pile of money. Captain Calamai was never officially convicted of any crime, but he was convicted by the silence. The Italian line never gave him another ship. He retired to his home in Genoa. He spent the rest of his days sitting in his study, looking at the sea, replaying the radar plot in his mind. He died in 1972. His last words, whispered in a delirium, were, "Are the passengers safe?" He never forgave himself, and the industry never forgave him for losing their symbol. But the ocean does not care about lawsuits. The ocean only cares about what is left behind. 250 feet below the surface of the Atlantic, the Andrea Doria began her second life. She was no longer a ship. She was a wreck. A wreck is a different organism. It is a reef, it is a structure that belongs to the sea. Barnacles attached themselves to the murals. Sea anemones bloomed on the railings. Fish swam through the holes where the lifeboats used to be. But the Andrea Doria was not just any wreck. She was the Mount Everest of scuba diving. She sat in cold, dark water. The currents at that location are vicious. The silt is fine and easily disturbed. One wrong kick of a fin and the visibility drops to zero. The wreck is covered in fishing nets, invisible traps that can snag a diver and hold him until his air runs out. And yet they came. They came for the thrill. They came for the history. But mostly, they came for the china. The Andrea Doria was full of treasure. Not gold bars, but artifacts, silver platters, ceramic vases, the famous Ginori china plates stamped with the logo of the Italian line. Divers risked their lives to bring up a soup bowl. They risked the bends, they risked nitrogen narcosis. They risked death, all to touch a piece of the vanished luxury. The wreck became a graveyard for the second time. Since the sinking, 16 divers have died on the Andrea Doria. That is nearly a third of the number of passengers who died in the original collision. The ship is jealous. She does not like to be disturbed. Over the decades, the wreck began to collapse. The salt ate the steel. The currents pushed against the hull. The upper decks folded downward. The promenade where the passengers had once walked in tuxedos crumbled into a chaotic pile of rust. Today she is unrecognizable. She is a heap of industrial waste on the sandy bottom. The swimming pools are gone. The bridge is gone. The unsinkable ship is slowly dissolving back into the elements that created her. Iron to iron, dust to dust. And what of the miracle girl? Linda Morgan grew up. This is the part of the story that the cameras usually miss. The aftermath of a miracle is just a life. She did not seek the spotlight. She did not write a tell-all book. She did not go on talk shows to relive the horror. She went to school. She became a nurse. She moved to San Antonio. She got married. She had children. She chose a life of service. Perhaps it was a way to pay back the debt of her survival. Perhaps she felt that because she had been spared, she had to be useful. She rarely spoke about the Andrea Doria. When people asked her about it, she would be polite but distant. She did not want to be defined by the worst night of her life. She did not want to be the girl who flew. She wanted to be the woman who lived. She carried the scars, of course, the physical scars on her knees and the invisible scars on her heart. She missed her sister every day. She missed the father who had been taken from her in a flash of steel. But she refused to be a tragedy. Linda Morgan died in 2021. She lived a full, quiet, meaningful life. And in the end, that was the true victory. The ship sank. The steel failed. The radar lied. But the human spirit, the quiet, resilient, ordinary human spirit, stayed afloat. So what is the verdict of the sea? What do we learn when we look back at the night of July 25th, 1956? We learn that progress is an illusion. We like to believe that we are getting safer. We look at our modern cruise ships, these floating apartment blocks that carry 5,000 people. We look at their GPS, their automated collision avoidance systems, their satellite phones. We say, that could never happen again. But it does happen. Ships still collide. Captains still make errors. Systems still fail. The Costa Concordia, the Sewol, the El Faro. The names change, but the story is always the same. It is the story of confidence. It is the story of men looking at screens and believing that they have tamed the wild. The Andrea Doria was the most beautiful ship of her time. She was built by the best engineers. She was sailed by the best captains. She was equipped with the best technology. And it took only one moment of confusion, 1 minute of fog, one assumption, to destroy her. The ocean is a mirror. It reflects our arrogance back at us. When we stand on the deck of a ship, looking out at the horizon, we feel powerful. We feel like masters of the planet. But the ocean is not impressed. The ocean is patient. It knows that steel rusts. It knows that radar blips can be misread. It knows that humans are small and tired and prone to mistakes. The story of the Andrea Doria is not a story about bad luck. It is a warning. It warns us that safety is not a product you can buy. It is a behavior. It is a constant, humble awareness of the danger. The moment you think you are safe, the moment you think the machine has solved the problem, is the moment the collision begins. The fog is always waiting. The other ship is always out there, somewhere in the dark, moving toward you. And the only thing that keeps us afloat is not the watertight compartments or the double hulls or the advanced sensors. It is the humility to slow down. Listen, can you hear it? The sound of the water, the sound of the waves lapping against the shore. It is the same sound that filled the ears of the survivors as they drifted in the lifeboats. It is the same sound that echoes through the rusting corridors of the wreck, 250 feet down. It is the sound of the world before we got here. And it is the sound of the world after we are gone. The Andrea Doria is a memory now, a ghost story told to sailors, a cautionary tale told to engineers. But if you listen closely to the silence of the Atlantic, you can still hear the echo of the horn. Whoo! A call into the void, a question asked of the darkness, and the answer is always the same: respect the sea, or she will take you.